My name is Russ Daggatt, and this is the peak water panel, although I think peak water may be something of a misnomer. Some of our water in aquifers is fossil water that's getting withdrawn and not being replenished, but for the most part, the water we use isn't disappearing. The issue is getting it to where it's needed in the quantities and with the quality that's needed. About 97.5% of the water on Earth is salty. Of the remaining 2.5%, about 2/3 of that is frozen. Of the remaining water, we are, with current usage patterns, the world will require about 40% more water 20 years from now than we're using today. It's been said that water will be to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. That is the key strategic natural resource that we fight about and which will largely control economic and political power. We're going to start this session with a case study of sorts on a major, pristine, intact watershed and some of the threats to that. And to introduce that, I'll turn to Wendy Pabich, who is the president of Water Futures, Inc.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a few facts and figures to kind of round out the scope of the problem. Today, 1 in 5 people lack access to drinking water. 40% of the world's population lacks access to adequate sanitation. And 70% of that water use is dedicated to agriculture. So food is integrally linked to this whole situation. Not only is it a question of draining, we're using water at an unsustainable rate, we're draining aquifers, we're drying rivers, but on top of it, we are sending contaminants into the environment. We're discharging wastewater, personal hygiene products, estrogen-mimicking compounds, nitrates, into our water systems, and we're not testing or monitoring for a lot of these things, nor are they being regulated. And so it's quite a tremendous challenge. And so Jonathan is going to give us a case study about the Baker River watershed in the Aysén region of Patagonia. The Baker River is Chile's largest river. It drains the northern ice cap. It's one of the most pristine systems in the world, and it's actually the 3rd largest freshwater reserve in the world. And Chile is currently facing significant struggles due to climate change, energy pressures, water issues in this emerging market. So.
Patagonia is all about abundance. It's abundance of possibility and potential, especially when we're talking about water. You walk through Patagonia and you just walk through, you don't have to take a water bottle. You never carry water anywhere. You take a cup with you. Any water you see, you dip your cup and you drink and you move on. And it's talking about water in every state, in the gaseous state, in the cryospheric state, which is the solid state, and in the liquid state, the hydrosphere. I'd like to play this video for you to show some of the changes that global climate change is initiating on the ice caps and changing our freshwater balance. We got to play on that button. There you go. These are time-lapse photography. This is my technological advance that we've been able to install on the northern ice cap. It's the first of its kind on the ice cap. There's only 2 examples of it in the southern hemisphere. You'll see that lake draining. That's a 2 square mile lake that's draining subglacially and then refilling and then draining and refilling. These are called GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, and they are ravaging all the valleys where people live down valley from the ice cap. They're jettisoning this river, the Baker River, that is normally flowing around 30,000 CFS, right to 120,000 CFS in about 8 hours, dropping its temperature from 11 degrees to 3 degrees Celsius. This is mega change, and it's changing the way people need to live on the landscape, and it's threatening what has been proposed as Chile's solution to their energy problem. In an archaic manner, they equate a kilogram of water to a kilowatt of electricity. They want to dam these rivers and send all that energy 1,400 miles to the north to Santiago over some of the most dynamic landscape on the face of the earth, as most people saw in the earthquakes about 2 months ago in Chile. So this is severe climate change. What my mission is, along with Wendy and a strong team of others, is to bring that initiative through scientific research, education, and tourism. We want to be able to value water much more highly than we do when we just say it's worth a kilowatt of electricity. So from this abundance standpoint, what I propose is that we take Patagonia's case study and we use it as the poster child for the developing world, the emerging markets where there is freshwater resources, to really care for it, so that we don't have to go back and in 100 years at the 108th fire, we don't have to go back and say, how do we reclaim these wonderful waters that we used to have, and we had a chance to really protect them and care for them? How can we do that now? By adding value through education, science, and tourism on the Patagonian ice caps.
And I would just add a few things about the energy struggles down there. I took a team of MIT students down there the winter before last to study these, the implications of these proposed hydro dams on this system. And as Jonathan said, this clear cut would constitute the largest clear cut in the world, bringing energy north to Santiago to satisfy the copper industry energy demand to the north. And it is not without carbon consequences. In fact, we looked at the carbon balance of the dam proposal, and largely due to the clear cut, it is a significant carbon impact. And so, you know, it's sort of posing the struggle of under the situation of climate change, which is causing these melting glaciers, which, by the way, one of which is poised above the proposed dams, sending these massive tsunamis downstream every once in a while. You know, the whole thing is linked. We're looking for technological solutions, and Chile's looking at hydropower as a solution. And so, you know, it sort of begs the question, is that the appropriate technology when we have the Atacama Desert north with a significant solar supply?
Mm-hmm. We've made reference to climate change, and certainly one of the primary impacts of climate change is going to be changes in the distribution of fresh water across the planet. But to be clear, entirely apart from climate change, we still have a problem meeting this growth need of something like a 40% increase in water demand on our current trajectory. And in fact, California is a good example of sort of all of the problems with water use. Fortunately, the water supply challenges lend themselves to technological and management solutions. And we have a couple of panelists here who are at the cutting edge of some of those efforts. I'd like to start with Tamin Pechet, who is CEO of Banyan Water, who's among other cool things, is in effect helping to build a smart grid for water, putting together smart water management companies. Tamin?
I've started a couple of organizations in water, and this is the second, and both of them emanated from the difficulty of being a venture capitalist in water. As formerly a venture capitalist, I'm sure Rafael will talk a little bit about that. The first was an organization called Imagine H2O, and what I found was it was very difficult to find businesses at an early stage that were doing something innovative in water that could become big enough to fund and support. And part of the problem was a lack of awareness of the commercial opportunity and how to approach that. So we set up a not-for-profit that runs a global prize for water startups and a business incubator based in San Francisco. We ran a prize last year for water efficiency businesses and had 50 teams competing, and the top 3 are now in our incubator program. This year we're going to do a prize for the water energy nexus, which we heard a little bit about here, the link between energy and water. I also found that a lot of these companies thought they were going to become really big because they had some better technology or more innovative way of doing something. But if you look at the industry, it just hasn't panned out that way. And most of the big companies have been integrators. And I think we need help managing our distribution infrastructure. And I've found a number of interesting small companies that play in particular pieces of that. And so I'm buying them and putting them together.
Rafael Simon is partner with VantagePoint Venture Partners and is also at the cutting edge of water technologies. Rafael, what are some of the companies you're looking at or technologies that you're interested in?
Well, we're looking at the wide range of technologies, desalination, water reuse, agriculture, efficiency. But part of the problem that we run into is that so much of the water problems are not technology driven. That with water, you can probably safely say that it's the worst managed substance on the earth. And yes, there are lots of water shortages. You know, we're even rationing water here in Los Angeles. But why is that? Well, agriculture, which has been stated, uses the most of the water, gets that water for virtually free. They're not allowed to freely trade it or sell it. It's unbelievably regulated and controlled. So there shouldn't be any surprise that when you give something out for essentially free, they don't even pay the full cost of the transportation of the water to the farms, let alone the cost of the water, putting a cost on water, then you'll have shortages. And I tend to have the viewpoint that water isn't that different from other things in the world, that if you regulated electricity or any other, or food or anything else like the way water's done and you gave it away to the biggest users for free, you'd be in the same situation. That if you had, right now we have an acceptance of rationing in Los Angeles. People shrug their shoulders and say, hey, what could we do? It didn't rain. Well, there's lots of things you can do. Lots of cities in the world have a tiny fraction of the percent of water that Los Angeles has. Maybe 5% of the water that Los Angeles has, yet they don't have shortages because they put in proper reuse infrastructure, they put in desalination plants, they've required agriculture to actually pay at least a tiny bit for their water, which causes them to not grow rice in the desert and to take some very, very basic steps. And that means that they can get away with a tiny, tiny fraction of the water that we have. So when the question of peak water is posed, it's like, well, if we continue to manage water the way we're doing it, yeah, eventually you'll run into, it'll get worse and worse. If you make some simple changes though, simple in theory, maybe more complex in reality, then I think most of those issues will go away. This creates a very challenging dynamic for technology investing when you have this overlay of this policy and societal aspect in front of you. Do you want to invest in companies which are really driven by some of these irrational forces when you're trying to make 10-year investments? It's a challenge.
We were talking at lunch about if you could do one thing, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And one of the ideas we kicked out was, at least on the residential use of water, is meter it. In a lot of parts of the country, water's not even metered. For example, half of the users in the San Joaquin Valley, which exists entirely by virtue of water from outside, half of the users don't have meters. And the resistance to metering is so strong in the Central Valley that anti-metering activists persuaded voters in Fresno to amend the city charter to prohibit water metering. Now that is changing, but it doesn't necessarily address the biggest use, which, as you notice, is agricultural use. Around the world, agricultural use accounts for 70 or 80% of water use, and about 80% of that is flooding the fields, where something like 70% of the water is lost through evaporation. So looks like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, but I'll throw it out to all the panelists. If you could make one or a couple of changes to how we manage water, what would that be?
I would add that we need to do something with our regulatory systems to try to force internalization of all these environmental externalities. For instance, in Idaho, where I live, we have the distinct pleasure of having the confined animal feeding operations from California, where the environmental regs are significantly more stringent, migrating to southern Idaho. And what we're seeing is spikes in nitrate concentrations in the groundwater that are an order of magnitude over the drinking water limit, and yet again another order of magnitude over ambient concentrations. And these are non-point sources; they're being entirely unregulated. So who will bear the cost of dealing with that?
So really internalizing the externalities which opens up a whole another subject, which is water pollution.
Right.
And which is sort of our current pattern of water use, which is sort of single pass-through, right? The water is treated as, one report that Tamin passed along, the Lux research report that they titled Evolution of the Hydrocosm, refers to the way we've used water as being like the hunter-gathering societies, where you go out there and you capture this natural resource, and then you discard it like a carcass. And what we need to do is move toward a cultivation model, similar to what happened in agriculture in 6000 BC or something.
Yeah, and I think there are vast country differences. And Rafael mentioned before we came up here, Israel is a leader in water management, and I think Israel reuses something like 70% of their water, and I think the US reuses something like 3% on average. But that's beginning to change. They're building a big recycling plant in Orange County, and I was just with the Southern California Municipal Water District yesterday, and they're looking at building more and more recycling solutions. And people are recognizing the need to do that better.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tamin, you referred earlier to the water energy nexus, and Wendy, that was something that you had mentioned also earlier.
So there's a lot of focus on reducing our energy consumption, and nobody's really looking at the embedded energy in our entire water system. Water is really heavy and difficult to move it around, and yet we pump it up, we treat it, we move it, we use it, we discharge it, we treat it again as wastewater, and then discharge it as wastewater to the environment. And all of that is extremely energy intensive. And in fact, in some small communities, like Haley, Idaho, where I live, 80% of the city's electricity bill goes to the wastewater plant. And so not only is it this sort of movement of water, but the wastewater itself is inherently energy rich. It's a carbon source. Mm-hmm. And so the wastewater plants in California, I ran some numbers on some of the larger systems here, and the carbon content in those waste streams is enough not only to power the wastewater treatment plant, but actually send energy off to the grid.
Yeah, you can see lots of ties. There's obviously the global warming connection. Something like 20% of the world's electrical power comes from hydro, I think. There's the pumping, like I don't know how much energy California must use pumping water from the north, where most of the water is, to the central part of the state in the south. Yeah. And then that also gets into another area, which is desalination, which is very energy intensive. Rafael or Tamin, can you speak to sort of the state-of-the-art of desalination technology, and how much promise does that hold?
Well, I'll give you a story about San Diego, because we're close to it, and the company I worked for before used to build a lot of desalination plants and water reuse plants. And San Diego has one of the worst water sources you can imagine. They're at the tail end of the Colorado River. About almost 90% of their water comes over in an aqueduct from the Colorado River. And we were working in the 90s on a water reuse plant, which was going to make it so they wouldn't have to import water from Northern California, which would actually use more electricity than desalinating it for the pumping of it. And they wouldn't have to worry about polluting their local environment anymore, because the wastewater would be treated to a level where there would be almost no discharge because you're using it for reuse. They'd have the entire infrastructure on one side of the San Andreas Fault, which is very important. And they could do this at a very reasonable cost. So what did San Diego decide? Absolutely no reuse of their water, using technology which was so advanced that the danger would be when you put this water back into a pipe in a municipal system, it will attack the pipe because it's pure H2O, and water doesn't like to be pure H2O. It'll take iron out of the pipe and dissolve it into the water to reach its normal equilibrium, which it has in the environment. So it's called an aggressive water. It's of such high quality that places that reuse water a lot, like Singapore, don't allow it to go into the drinking water system because they want to use it for semiconductor rinse water, where water has a higher level of value. San Diego said, absolutely not. We want to keep drinking our Colorado River water, which is, by the time it reaches San Diego, has been in and out of a couple pigs, a couple cows, filled with pesticide. And another job we're working at in Las Vegas, water reuse was a very tricky issue for them, because when they started to reuse their water, they got calls from San Diego saying, hey, if you don't put your sewage back into the Colorado River, what are we going to drink? It's a true story. So they voted it down. And now they're building a desalination plant, maybe, in Carlsbad. It's still wait and see if it's going to go. And that's going to cost several times as much, and it's not going to address the wastewater issue. And you just, as you're a company, you know, this has been a job, this water reuse job in San Diego. The company's still working on it. It's been like a 15-year process. And it's just all this insanity keeps going on all the time when there's really good, clear solutions that can be done.
Well, it was Mark, when it comes to California and the American West, I think it was Mark Twain that said, whiskey's for drinking and water is for fighting over. So trying to change some of these institutional constraints are pretty challenging. How does the evolution of that technology look? I mean, where is it going from a cost standpoint and an energy use standpoint?
It's getting cheaper and cheaper. I mean, desalination, you could say, is the worst case, because there's essentially infinite ocean, and with enough money, you could desalinate as much water as you wanted. Given that desalinated water might cost, say, 8 times more than very easy treated water, maybe 4 times more per average than normal water that you would normally treat. But the treatment cost is maybe 1/3 to 1/4 of the cost of the delivered water. The rest is the infrastructure and the utility system. So when you have something which represents 1/4 of the value that costs 4 times as much, what does that mean? That means that you would essentially, if we had to desalinate all the water in California, your bill would double, which, you know, wouldn't be nice, but you're talking something which wouldn't be an apocalyptic situation. And that's the worst case scenario. Water reuse is generally less than half the cost of desalination. And, you know, water conservation is often free. Like for these farmers we're talking about, one of the big problems in irrigation is overwatering. Overwatering stunts the yields of crops. When people put in smart irrigation systems to save water, they get a crop increase of anywhere from 2 to 10%, which actually pays for the entire smart irrigation system in 1 or 2 years. So you could solve the water problem and have farmers make a lot more money at the same time.
I want to give us a couple of minutes for questions, but Rafael just hit really on what you're working on, which is smart water systems. The same notion as a kind of a smart grid, bringing that to water. What are some of the, elaborate on that concept for us.
Sure, and Rafael and I have looked at some of these same companies in the agricultural space, but I think when it comes to cities and how they move their water around, we waste around 20% of water to leakage in America. It's much more internationally in a lot of places. And by and large, we just have no idea what's happening underground. We have the system of pipes and pumps, and it's very costly. Estimates are up to $1 trillion need just to maintain and replace the existing infrastructure in the US, and it's a blind spot. And with a little bit better information technology and some better sensors, many of which are already out there, the technology's been developed, and there are companies that have been struggling and fighting to get it to market, but they've proven the efficacy of their solutions. You can give visibility into what's happening in the assets underground to the utility managers who are responsible for it. They just haven't really started buying that en masse, but I'm betting that they will.
It sounds like in this country, one of the major restraints, again, are just these institutional constraints, whereas in other parts of the world, the big challenge is just they don't have the water resources to begin with. So we've got a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can attack, but at least we have water that we can reuse or become more efficient in our use. If there are any questions, Wendy,
I was just going to add that it's also a legal challenge. In the western part of the country, water law dictates a use it or lose it clause on your water rights. So, I mean, it's a legal problem as well.
I should say I have a home upstream from Wendy in Idaho, so yeah, I'm afraid you're out of luck.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? We've got a couple of minutes left.
Victor Purton, one of the things that Mark Anderson often reminds us of is the big idea. And Australia started very much like the conversation we've had here 20 years ago. And what we did was actually bring market mechanisms to bear. We had all of these regulatory problems, farmers not wanting to give up water, use it or lose it. And we introduced new regulatory systems that actually compensated the farmers for what they thought they might have lost. But the advantage to the community, for instance, in altering an irrigation system to save 80% of the water losses was so great that compensation was easy. And to my mind, one of the easiest things I've had to market in the US is Australian water technology. Rubicon, for instance, in Colorado is going fabulously in its technology. But the important thing in California is the regulatory impediments. And someone's actually got to do the big regulatory change that persuades the farmers that they can give up some of their rights, persuades city folk that they can actually reduce water consumption by 80% and still have clean clothes and not smell. And you know, I think Schwarzenegger tried it, but the legislature blocked it. And I think the important thing for California is that big regulatory change. So too in some of the other states. But I think, you know, if I can give one model, and I think certainly the last speaker, you know, I think is quite aware of what, you know, Israel's done and what Australia's done, is you can actually get city communities to change their water patterns quite dramatically with sort of a patriotic fervour or zeal. And you get farming communities to give up some of those rights if you compensate them appropriately money-wise. So to my mind, it's a market mechanism. The thing that puzzles me about the United States is the home of capitalism is so resistant to the notion of market pricing for water.
Mm-hmm. Any reactions?
I mean, the one thing you didn't mention was that Australia was suffering a 10-year drought, which was 12-year drought, which people were arguing whether it was just a 100-year drought or maybe even a 1,000-year drought in the cycle. And things got to the point where, you know, Sydney with a 3-year-long reservoir was looking like maybe it was actually going to run out of water. And when things got that serious, people just said, okay, enough with the games. Let's do the things we need to do to solve it. We're not there. Even with the problems we have in California, we're not quite there yet. We need a drought maybe that severe to do it.
Well, alas, it seems like we're already out of time, although it seems like we're just getting rolling. You think reforming healthcare was easy, try changing water policy in the West. Thank you to our panelists.